Well, greetings and welcome to this Zoom meeting on one of the most sweeping climate laws in the country. And this presentation is brought to you by the League of Women Voters of Massachusetts, the Environmental Action and Advocacy Committee. Just before we begin the presentation, I would like to go over a few of the technical details about this particular presentation and the questions, hopefully answer some of the questions that many often have when they're on a presentation like this. The first question that we're going to answer is that yes, the webinar will be recorded and will be sent out. The link will be sent out to you as registrants as soon as it's available. It will also be posted on the League of Women Voters website. So you'll have all that information, including any informational links that we think would be of interest and that are relevant to this topic. Please realize or know that we are conducting this forum using Zoom meeting rather than as a webinar. So if you turn your video on, you may be seen in the recording. If you'd rather not be seen in the recording, just please turn off your video and you will be fine. During the forum, please keep your microphone muted for the entire time. During the slide presentations, please keep your video off, but you are welcome to turn on your video during the Q&A period at the end so that the speakers can see you. If you have a question for the speakers, please type it into the chat box at any point. We'll be monitoring the questions and we'll ask questions we feel are the most relevant to the whole audience. Apologies if your question is not asked. Questions will be asked after both speakers have completed their presentations. And please limit your use of chat to questions pertaining to the presentations. So now it is time to introduce our speakers and begin the program. The title of this presentation is The Race to Zero Emissions, the Massachusetts Next Generation Climate Law and the Clean Energy and Climate Plan. Personally, I think every presentation on climate should be entitled The Race to Zero Emissions as a persistent and consistent reminder of this critical objective. Our presentation this afternoon is focused on how we plan to do just that here in Massachusetts, get to zero emissions as quickly as possible. It's a pleasure and an honor to introduce John Rogers and Matt Rusteika as our presenters. John is a senior analyst at the Union of Concerned Scientists, and he leads the analysis of the Union of Concerned Scientists Energy Campaign. Prior to his current role, John managed the organization's Northeast Clean Energy Project, focusing on a range of clean energy and climate policies at the regional level. He brings 3 decades of accumulated experience and expertise in clean energy, technology, and policies. Matt leads Acadia Center's Buildings Initiative, focused on reduction of emissions from the building sector, a major source of emissions. He has also led strategic planning efforts at the Massachusetts Department of Energy and coordinated the state's leading energy efficiency plan, and also as a lead evaluator of energy efficiency programs across the US and Canada. I think you'll find that both of these presenters bring us a wealth of knowledge and experience on this topic. Well, I think without further ado, I'd like to now turn it over to John Rogers and to Matt Rusteika. Thank you, John.
Great, thank you, Lana. Thank you, Karen. Thanks to the League of Women Voters, and thanks to you all for joining the conversation today. This is a terrific topic, and I agree with Lana. Everything should be about the race to zero, and doing that race right. And part of doing that race correctly, I think, is considering this from various angles. We're going to look at a few of them today in our hour together. We won't have enough time to touch on everything, but Matt, I'm looking forward to Matt's presentation because it's a terrific complement to, I think, to some of the things I will talk about. I'm going to share my screen now. Let's see. Great, I think you can see it. Just speak up if you can't. But I will be talking largely about Massachusetts climate and climate change and the race to zero. Matt and I will each keep our remarks to around 15 minutes, so that we'll have plenty of time for questions, and looking forward to that part. So the conversation really around this climate law. Well, actually, let me say a word about my organization. I work for the Union of Concerned Scientists, as Lana said. We're a member-based organization that really looks to put science into action, bringing science and scientific voices into the policymaking arena to solve our planet's most pressing problems. And that's nuclear weapons, that's food sustainability, that's science and democracy. It's also several of our programs have to do with climate change and climate solutions. I'm fortunate to work in the clean energy space, which has been an amazing space to work for the last 30 years, and particularly for the last 10 or 12, as things have moved along. And victories like this, like the climate law, is one reason why it's been such an exciting place, exciting sector to work in. So the conversation around this law really started around 2.5 years ago. The core of it was something called the 2050 Roadmap to a Clean and Thriving Commonwealth. And it was introduced 2.5 years ago, went through the legislative processes. A pandemic hit that sort of slowed things down. But we did, by the very end of what would have been what was the end of the regular session of the Massachusetts legislature, July 31st at midnight. By that point, we had gotten the bill did get through the House of Representatives and the state Senate. Then things went dark for a while. The legislature understandably had a lot of things going on. It was also a little harder for the chamber's representatives, what's called the conference committee, made up of 3 representatives from each chamber, a little harder to coordinate when you can't actually get together. But it did resurface actually in the waning days of the actual session. So actually in the very beginning of January of this year, popped out of the conference committee finally, and then it was up to each house to pass it. They passed it. They sent it to the governor, who was not entirely pleased because he could sort of either take it or leave it. What he did was amend it, which was his right, and send it back to the legislature. By that point, the legislature was fully done with the 2019-2020 legislative session. And so there was no recourse at that point, nothing that could be done. And if you remember from Schoolhouse Rock from the 1970s, how a bill happens, legislature passes it, the chief executive signs it or vetoes it, then the legislature gets to decide what it's going to do. But that all ran out of time. Fortunately, in the early days, very early days of this legislative session, so 2021 and 2022, the Senate President Karen Spilka and the brand new Speaker of the House, Ron Mariano, they even before the governor had vetoed it the first time or suggested the amendments, they had said, we're going to put it forth again, and they stayed true to their word. Both chambers passed it exactly as it was. So because it was exactly as it was, went back to the governor. He said, hey, I proposed some amendments. So he proposed amendments again, sent it back, and they amazingly did it for a third time. They passed accepting some of the governor's amendments, not all of them, but it was actually a good give and take there. At the end, the governor was pleased to see that version, and we got a signing ceremony at the end of March. I and others were really worried that this might drag on through this legislative session, and that might be it for what we get for climate legislation in this session. But this is early enough. I think we can make a strong case that this was last year's business, last session's business. So here's the signing ceremony. And this truly was a landmark, I think we called it a landmark win for equitable climate policy. And I'll talk about a few of the aspects, and then Matt will touch on more, but what we think makes this bill, this now law, so special. One is what it did in terms of our climate goals. So Lana mentioned the race to zero. Under the landmark 2008 legislation, the Global Warming Solutions Act, which was really important for its time, basically the legislature said, okay, let's look at the 1990 emissions, and here's where we were as of 2008, and let's aim for a reduction, and they actually gave a range, and it was up to the administration. The administration set it at 25%, which was as strong as the law would allow them. 25% reduction from 1990 levels. And by mid-century, let's make sure we have reductions of at least 80%. That was really important and arguably in keeping with the science at that point. Now, 13 years later, we understand that climate change has gotten much more serious. We've lost a decade in a lot of ways. And so what the climate roadmap bill did was take all that and strengthen the targets. And most really importantly, it strengthened the 2050 target to net zero. So instead of 80% reductions, we essentially have to get rid of, on a net basis, get rid of all the emissions across our economy. It also, equally importantly, set targets for 2030 and 2040. So reductions of at least 50% by 2030 and at least 75% by 2040. Those are really important pieces because there are a lot of things we could do in the near term for near-term reductions, think natural gas, that turn out to be dead ends in the long term. But the law didn't stop there in terms of the climate targets. It also required that the administration come up with targets for each intervening 5-year period, so 25, 35, and 45, just to make sure that we know what our path looks like and that we're not going off the rails. And it required the administration to come up with sector-specific targets. So we look at the opportunities within the electricity or the transportation or the building sector, for example, and really understand what's possible and how far those can be pushed toward toward the overall goal. So the second thing that this law did that I'm going to talk about is really put in place more impetus for clean energy, a stronger push for clean energy. And that includes offshore wind, which is a technology I focus a lot on. If you look at where different states, the targets the different states have set for their states or the utilities in their states, Massachusetts was an early adopter, the first state in 2016, and then upped it in 2018. But to really keep pace with other states, what this law did was add another 2,400 megawatts of requirement. Not coincidentally, maybe, that puts us ahead of Virginia, my home state. So really strong target for offshore wind, which is going to be a major driver, major source of clean energy for the state, but also a major driver of economic development and job creation. There are pieces in this law around solar, both at the large scale and at the small scale. There is an increase in the renewable portfolio standard. It's a very small increase, but it's better than nothing. And there's actually, for those of you like me living in territories and communities served by municipal utilities, municipal light plants, there are 40 MLPs in the state serving more than 50 communities. And it actually, for the first time, sort of brings them within this climate regime by requiring certain reductions in the emissions associated with the electricity, or it ramps up their clean energy target. It's not as strong as it could be, and but I for one am glad that we've got something that I can use to, or that my municipal light plant can use to guide its progress on clean energy. The third piece that we really focused on this law, that it pulled in a totally separate bill around environmental justice. So for those of you who were involved, and I expect some of you have been involved, for example, in the Weymouth compressor station, but this is East Boston, where there's a proposal to put an electrical substation just off to the left here. And a community, East Boston, that has seen more than its fair share of environmental injustices. What the new law requires, among other things, well, one, it codifies what environmental justice is in law for the first time. So we now have that in statute. And it requires consideration of cumulative impacts. So not looking at a project just as a project, but understanding it in the context of everything that community and surrounding communities have already had put upon them. So in the case of East Boston, the millions of gallons of jet fuel that are stored just to the left near this substation site, or different facilities that have been put here or near, the level of pollution burden that the community is already facing. So three important pieces: setting setting updating the actual targets for emissions reduction, putting in place more clean energy help to get us there, and focusing on environmental justice, making that a real piece of the consideration as we move. So not just a move toward climate solutions, but toward equitable climate solutions. Across the street, actually, at the same time this was going on, so where the administration does its work, there was another process that had been put in place by the Global Warming Solutions Act. The administration actually was coming up with a roadmap to 2050. And actually, it was looking at 80% reductions. The governor then said, no, let's make it net zero. Even before the legislature codified that in law, the administration, the governor had already said, let's look at net zero. And so it explored different pathways to getting to net zero by mid-century. It also set a target for 2030. So remember, the Global Warming Solutions Act did not have that. And it talked about what these next 10 years look like. So here's just a quick look at one of their graphs. You see transportation, electricity, buildings. You see where we are now in 2021. You can see the transportation and buildings are bigger pieces of this than the electric sector. We've made a lot of progress in the electric sector. We're certainly not done, but some important pieces there. And so the Massachusetts Clean Energy and Climate Plan says, okay, how do we get these next 10 years? And they looked at emissions. Green is residential here, blue is commercial. And they rightly point out that the biggest issues are around transportation and around buildings. And you will hear more from Matt around buildings and efficiency. And those are really important pieces. When they set the 2030 target, what the administration said before the legislature had finished its work, they said, well, we think 45% reductions are what makes sense. So it's got the administration saying 45% reductions by 2030, the legislature in its bill saying 50% now in law. So those aren't the same. And so the administration is now having to go back to its clean energy and climate plan, go figure out before it finalizes it where those extra few percents come from. I will say that so much of what we're talking about today is due to certainly to people weighing in a big way, including in the climate march in September 2019, but also the champions in the State House, and there are many, and organizations. If you look at the environmental justice provisions, organizations like Green Roots, which we've been pleased to support in the East Boston work, Neighbor to Neighbor. There's something called the Massachusetts Environmental Justice Legislative Table. So these are community groups and organizers and leaders who are really bringing that perspective, including around environmental justice, and bringing that. And I would encourage you to bring them into whatever conversations you can. Just really quickly thinking about where we go from here and what your piece of this is. The climate law, it's so easy to think, okay, the law has been signed, we're in good shape, we're done. That's just the starting point. So the implementation, there will be rulemaking, there will be regulations that come out of this. There will be opportunities for public engagement. I encourage you to keep looking for those and engage as you can. I don't know how that updating of the Clean Energy and Climate Plan is going to happen, but there may be opportunities there. There will certainly be opportunities to make sure that this administration and subsequent ones are following that plan to get us to 2030. And you see the State House there. We're not done legislatively. We're never done legislatively. But I'll name just one opportunity. That there's something called the 100% Clean Act, which would sort of recognize that the power sector is our best opportunity for cleaning up not just itself, but other sectors of the economy. So electrifying transportation, electrifying home heating with heat pumps, for example. So terrific opportunities. This would set a requirement of 100% clean electricity by 2035, and then 100% across those three sectors, across the power sector, transportation, and buildings by 2045. So I will leave it there, turn it over to Matt, and look forward to the Q&A. Thank you very much.
All righty. Thank you, John. Let me just share my screen here. All right. Can you see my notes? No. Okay, great. So thank you all. I just want to first thank you all for being here, and thank you very much to the League of Women Voters for having me today. Just a real brief word about Acadia Center, where I work. We are a nonprofit research and advocacy organization that works in clean energy. As Lana said at the beginning of the call, I run our buildings initiative, which also includes some of the work we're doing on gas, phasing out natural gas. But we have a bunch of other initiatives as well, which I invite you to check out on our website, which is acadiacenter.org. John gave us some information here about what the law, the most recent climate law, and the Clean Energy and Climate Plan do. I think my subject matter here is going to pertain mostly to what it doesn't do, what's not in the law, what doesn't have the force of law yet. So S9, the climate law, set, as John mentioned, these sector sublimits. So one is for buildings. They're not binding as long as the statewide is matching its goals. And there's also like $12 million for Mass Clean Energy Center to run a workforce development program around building electrification. But there's not much else in there that pertains specifically to buildings. Yet the Clean Energy and Climate Plan has this pretty kind of audacious goal to electrify 1 million homes in the state out of like 2.6 million housing units and at least 300 million square feet of commercial space. So there's a little disconnect there, and I want to just kind of spend some time talking about that. There are like 800,000 homes and about 680 million square feet of real estate, commercial real estate, that heat with oil or propane. So we can make a big dent in the climate plan goals just by targeting those buildings. And in fact, they do tend to be less efficient equipment, as well as less efficient building shells. That's gonna lead to a lot of emissions on its own. And it happens that the consumer economics of those switches, particularly with respect to propane, tend to be really positive for almost every consumer. However, it is also clear that we kind of need to start confronting our reliance on natural gas, especially in the residential sector. And there's a few reasons for that. The first is that a lot of boilers and furnaces that are installed today are still going to be running in 2050. And the second kind of major reason is that transitioning the gas distribution system, all the pipelines under all the roads near your house, it's just such a big project. It's like turning an ocean liner. So that's kind of to set the stage here. I mean, we're going to have to balance a bunch of different plates at once in buildings. I want to focus most of my comments here on environmental justice. So what John detailed about the law, kind of says for the first time we've defined environmental justice. There's some language in the law about what it means, and some specific rules about how to identify situations where an environmental injustice has taken place. Different kind of criteria for determining that. What we're working on at Acadia Center with respect to environmental justice in buildings is to kind of create some information about how to remediate the environmental injustice that the law kind of stipulates. So these are some charts from our powerhouse model. It's a home energy model that kind of takes the weather in different cities for every hour of the year and models out different scenarios in a really kind of granular way. And we know that low income, moderate income residents of the Commonwealth are more likely to live in kind of low quality housing, language isolated communities, non-white communities, renters, all more likely to live in housing that's older, just kind of in poorer repair. And I bring that up because while environmental justice kind of encompasses a lot of different things with respect to buildings, a big part of it is that we need to target investments in the communities that have this lower quality housing. I think this is a kind of a good opportunity because, we can reduce energy burden, we can reduce bills in those units. We can improve health. We can make them healthier to live in, like less kind of indoor air pollution, better thermal comfort. People are less cold in the winter, not as hot in the summer. And we can reduce emissions all at the same time. And by that, I mean, it's not that we can like do all those things together. It means that the same things that we do to buildings that make them healthier also reduce emissions, and so it's kind of like a good opportunity to just kind of, hit all these birds with one stone. And I'm a vegetarian, so I apologize for using that euphemism. So what upgrades are those, right? What can we actually do to buildings? These charts show energy bills and emissions on the right, energy bills on the left, in an old kind of drafty home before and after weatherization. And if you have ever had any mass save work done in your house, you probably kind of know what this entails. Unfortunately, John, who lives in MLP, maybe doesn't, because mass save isn't available in MLPs yet. Basically, it just means kind of blowing in insulation, insulation in your walls, in your attic, around your joists, which is the kind of wood that's above your foundation wall in your basement, floors, depending on the situation, as well as air sealing, so kind of door sweeps and stuff like that, spray foam in the joists in the attic, that type of stuff. As you can see, those types of improvements can reduce bills in these unhealthy, low quality housing units by a lot. That's kind of, an article of faith, and we do a lot of weatherization, about 32,000 homes a year in Massachusetts. And it's a big part of how we're going to kind of cobble together enough solutions to reduce emissions to the degree that we need to, as the chart on the right shows. For these same homes, you can reduce bills by even more and reduce emissions by quite a bit, almost 80%, by weatherizing and electrifying the building. And John also touched on this a little bit. What is electrification? Many of you may have kind of heard this word bandied about. It's just when you convert everything that burns fossil fuels in your house or in a building to efficient electric equipment. And by that, we don't mean kind of the old electric baseboard that was costing you $1 million a year to run in the 70s and 80s. We're talking about heat pumps primarily, as well as induction stoves for cooking. And I'll get into a little bit later kind of how those work, what they are. And Mass Save, if you don't live in an MLP, can provide financial assistance for this. But something that we're working on is to advocate at the Energy Efficiency Advisory Council, which is the body that oversees all our energy efficiency investments in the state, for changes in how participants are qualified to kind of reduce legwork, admin costs, and changes to program design so that the marketplace can be kind of incented and able to achieve these environmental justice improvements that we're trying to see after the law. So buildings, what can I do? Well, a lot. You all live in buildings, presumably. We need an electrification target. So we have these emissions targets in the law. There's a lot of kind of nuance to that when it kind of hits the ground. We need to make sure that as a state, we're kind of privileging electrification because it's really the only way to reduce emissions to the degree that we need. So talk to your representatives about that. We need an electrification target. New York has one, Maine has one, we need one now. We need to have financial assistance. Some of this stuff can be expensive, especially if you're trying to do it all at once, weatherization and heat pumps and so forth, especially for renters, especially for low and moderate income households. So ask the utilities to provide it through Mass Save. We've got the Energy Efficiency Advisory Council. You can make public comment there. That's something you can do. And lastly, if you're someone who has the desire, if someone has the means, I would never ask. I'm sorry, buddy. I'm working right now. We have to. I'll be right there. Can you go in the back room, please? I'm sorry. You got to go, bud. I'm sorry. Sorry, my son's home with me today. If you have the notion, you can electrify and weatherize your home as well. Mass Save again has financial assistance for this, and there's plenty of competent contractors who will walk you all the way through it. This is the real kind of. I'll finish up quick here. This is the real kind of meat of it here. Since 1990, which is the reference point for all our climate laws, emissions in Massachusetts have declined by about 19 million metric tons per year. That's about 23%, right, as of 2018, which is the most recent data we have. Emissions from using coal in power plants declined by like 10 million metric tons. Emissions from using petroleum in power plants declined by 11 million metric tons. So the total of those things is greater than the total reduction. So what happened here? Natural gas took over, right? Natural gas use in buildings has increased 58% since 1990. Emissions from gas and power plants have increased by more than 100% since 1990. Yet, state law says net zero, right? Natural gas in the past has been kind of billed as this important bridge fuel, right? But it still emits. It still emits quite a bit. And now we're super duper reliant on it. So this is one of the plates that we have to keep in the air, right? While we're out there weatherizing homes and installing heat pumps, as many as we can, we have to really start biting the bullet on gas. And the Clean Energy and Climate Plan, neither the Clean Energy and Climate Plan nor the law specifically addressed gas, despite the humongous challenge that it represents to our climate future. As I mentioned, your boiler, if you install a new boiler today, it could easily still be working in 2050. Just for instance, last year I helped my dad replace the two boilers in the family house. They were both manufactured in 1956. You can make these things last forever. That's the truth. Unfortunately, no Deus ex machina is imminent here. Just another word on why this is important. So natural gas is a gas. It consists primarily of methane, which is itself a greenhouse gas, with a global warming potential that's about 86 times that of carbon dioxide alone. So it's a super potent greenhouse gas, and it leaks out of pipelines everywhere. It leaks out of pipelines, leaks out of the compressor station in Weymouth, which is right near my house, in enormous quantities. And our emissions accounting that I just took you through doesn't account for that. So in fact, natural gas kind of represents more of the real emissions out in the world than it does on paper. So this is something important to keep in mind. If you account for kind of all the emissions from natural gas, not just burning it, but also the leaks in the distribution system, and then the leaks that take place like around the wells where they get it from and stuff like that, it's actually worse than coal. And so that's something to bear in mind as we move ahead here. One more thing, what about renewable gas? A lot of times you'll see like Eversource or different kind of gas companies argue that, well, the answer to this is just to put a different molecule or in like a greener molecule in the same pipe. Not to get too far into this, studies found that it can only really conceivably account for probably 10%, 12% of all the gas that we use. It's also super expensive. The gas industry funded a study that showed that only half of the amount that's possible to produce could be produced for less than $20 an MMBTU before being marked up for retail sale. So for context, the residential price of heating oil is about $19.90. So it's quite a bit more expensive than that. And it's still methane. It still leaks, still has the same global warming potential, still methane. So on the positive side, what's a heat pump? We've heard it mentioned. You've all had experience kind of with window air conditioners, central air conditioners. It's just that, but it also does heat. The same process, but in reverse. So heat moves from hot to cold. It kind of gathers heat from the outside air. As long as it's not absolute zero outside, you can still get heat from the air. And then it kind of cycles it inside, blows a fan, and deposits the heat inside your home. Because moving heat is much more efficient than actually creating it, heat pumps are about 300% efficient. I've got one in my own house. It's fantastic. There's a concern because we have kind of high electric prices in New England that electrification is going to cost people a lot of money. Our research, which again is kind of done super in a super granular way on an hourly basis, using all the kind of same processes that you would use if you were an HVAC contractor. Shows that if you account for air conditioning, you're kind of spending about the same amount with a heat pump. If you combine electrification and weatherization, and then you're also electrifying, like, your water heater, your stove, your clothes dryer, your house is actually quite a bit less expensive to run in terms of energy bills. And as I mentioned, if your house is like leakier than average, if you live in a house that was built in like the 19th century, which a lot of people do, then these impacts are even more pronounced. So what can we do about this? We don't have a plan right now to phase out the use of natural gas in Massachusetts. And that's really the most glaring issue here. So we need to demand one. We need to demand that plan. We have a lot of misconceptions, misapprehensions about the potential of that alternative fuels can bring to the process. It's really important that we get the message out about that. And lastly, if you use gas for heating in your house, which most people do, about 52% of households in Massachusetts, that weatherization is a great way to cut back on usage in the near term. And also just get that heat pump in there if you can. That's it for me. Let's see here, slideshow.
Wow. Okay. I believe, John, did you want to add some things at the end here?
Sure, if I could, that was terrific, Matt, and there are lots of questions in the chat about heat pumps, so I hope you will leap in as soon as we get to the Q&A part. But just want to pull the lens back a little bit, because Massachusetts is not an island. We're part of a regional, so again, thinking from the power sector perspective, we're part of a regional power grid, New England, ISO New England, our grid operator. Heavily, as Matt was saying, about so many of us heavily dependent on natural gas. So there are opportunities certainly there to improve how decision making happens there. And they put in processes just in the last few months for talking about public engagement around the grid. This is something New England governors are very keen on, because how our state laws and state legislative requirements fit in with how the grid is operated. There's a little bit of a disconnect there, and folks are really trying to fix that. And part of that is listening to the public and allowing the public to engage in decision making at the regional level. So if that's something you're into, there's certainly opportunities to engage there. Nationally, one of the most exciting things that's happened lately, in the climate space last month, as I'm sure you heard, President Biden announced our contribution to the sequel to the Paris process, or the climate targets, basically saying 50% reductions of at least 50% by 2030. That's from 2005 levels, not from 1990 levels, but still, so Massachusetts is actually ahead of that, will be ahead of that as we implement. And one other thing, so that fits into the international scene, also at the national scene, are moves within the infrastructure bill, the American Jobs Plan, that actually not a bill yet, but something put forth by the Biden administration. There is included in that various pieces around clean energy, including a clean energy standard, which would be like our state renewable portfolio standard, but with a few other technologies thrown in. That will find its way into a bill. Those will need to find, some version of that needs to find its way through Congress. It will not be easy, but really important discussions taking place. So that's all I wanted to say, and now happy to take questions once Matt tells us more about heat pumps, maybe.
Okay. Well, okay. So as is often said, I don't know why I can't unvideo myself. Karen, can you handle that? Anyway, I mean, I'd like to, never mind. Let's just move on. So something about your presentation, Matt, just sort of released a well of questions about heat pumps and electrification. So quite a few really excellent questions we want to get to. I just want to quickly put a plug in for the league. We have several bills that are attempting to deal with some of the issues you brought up, Matt. So I hope all participants here will take a look at the league website on that. But okay, start my video. I just got a message from, okay, there we are. So let me pick up some of these questions. They're not going to be in order anymore necessarily, but do the best I can. Okay, questions about the grid being able to handle all this, quote, electrification that's going to be coming on board. Matt or John, any comments on that?
I will say this isn't just a Massachusetts issue. This is a regional issue in terms of how we connect things, how we get electrons from one place to the other. Think about from a regional basis, we have lots of wind resources in resource in northern Maine. Getting that into Massachusetts, getting that into the rest of New England has been a real holdup. From a national basis, lots of wind in, and I'm using wind as an example here because it's a little bit more concentrated, but getting it from the Great Plains to the Midwest and then on to the East Coast. As offshore wind becomes more and more of an opportunity here, we're going to want to see transmission moving it in the other direction. So that's really interesting. And certainly at the local level, there will have to be some upgrades. But Matt, do you want to? And I'm pressing Matt on this because I'm looking into a heat pump myself. We have them for my wife's office, but I'm looking into it, waiting for a quote for home. And Matt and I had a good discussion about this. Matt, do you want to address some of the concerns expressed there about the efficiency of heat pumps or the appropriateness for Massachusetts?
Yeah, so I'll answer the grid question first, and then I will answer my own question. There's a ton of like misconceptions about heat pumps out there for good reason. So from the grid perspective, you have to keep in mind that a heat pump is used for both heating and air conditioning. So it can save demand and energy. It's save kilowatt hours as well as peak demand at peak times relative to your current air conditioning solution. Certainly if you have a central air conditioner, it's likely more than twice as efficient as what's there now. And even if you have room air conditioners, once you have 2 or 3 of them going at once, an air source heat pump is going to be more efficient. It's going to draw less power from the grid. So it increases power in the winter, but it reduces power in the summer. So at least like in the next 10 years, there's going to be a lot of progress made in the next 10 years. It's not the winter peak won't even under the super optimistic climate projections, the winter peak won't overtake the current summer peak. So there'll be really no extra demand. Once you get down to the kind of local level and the level of the individual generator, that's different, and certainly not really my area. One thing that I want to just get out there, just to make sure I get to say it before the time is up, I saw a couple of comments to the effect that like heat pumps don't work in the cold. Heat pumping technologies are more than 100 years old. Air conditioning was invented in like 1920. That's all it is. It's the same thing. It's the same process, but in reverse, right? So this is a mature technology. Heat pumps are sold all across the world. Japan, Sweden, they're common in Sweden and across Europe. In the United States, they've mostly been sold in the South, right? Those heat pumps can't handle the cold. They're what's called a single stage or a 2-stage heat pump. It's basically like if you have most like gas furnaces or oil boilers or whatever are either like on or off. With a heat pump, the cold climate models kind of they're equipped to modulate their output, the fan, the refrigerant, the different kind of pieces of the apparatus, and that ability to like closely modulate to what the thermostat demands, as well as some other innovations around like how to cycle the refrigerant, means that the best heat pumps on the market today can provide 100% of their rated capacity at negative 13 degrees. And I would say that in the past 10 years, it's been negative 13 degrees for exactly 0 hours in Massachusetts. So if you have any doubts that a heat pump can provide your heat, then I would urge you strongly to please dispense with them, because it's definitely not true.
Thank you, Matt. And I'm seeing a couple of comments from people who actually have newer technology heat pumps, and they're saying that they've had to rely on their traditional heat source far, far less than anyone would have expected. So I think there's been a tremendous amount of change and improvement in the technology there. So I think we're at a kind of a beginning here in terms of what is afoot. But I think the fact that we have this law, that there is the kind of impetus that John mentioned at the federal level, the efforts at the state level, you're going to see a lot more push around research and development to improve the current technologies and lead us into new technologies. So I think that's great. I did want to ask a personal question. Frankly, I'm going to intrude my question on this because I think a lot of people have been concerned about this. And that is the fact that the gas utilities are continuing to lay gas pipe to continue distribution of gas, natural gas. Have they just not gotten the memo yet, or what is going on here? We're talking about an asset that looks very likely to be stranded in the not too distant future. The disinformation that's coming from the natural gas utilities, the fact that they're continuing to push this because that is a large part of their profit sector. How do we deal with that? Anyone?
That's an excellent question. So I think part of the reason why I have focused in my talk today heavily on gas is just to kind of, I think part of the reason why they're not, they haven't got the memo. They're certainly aware that there's no plan right now to deal with gas because people kind of, I think that there's this outdated sense that it's like, we're still on the bridge, it can kind of help in the near term and stuff. So, my organization, I don't want to speak for John. I assume his organization is trying to kind of bring that to light, the fact that we kind of need to have a plan. We need to start making moves on that. But it's a huge issue. There's no plan. We know what the plan should entail. The future of heat proceedings at the DPU and the bill kind of get to some of that. But that's something that the people on this call can do is to ask for a plan.
Thank you. And I wanted to also, reinforce that message about asking for a plan, and also the future of heat bill that is out there, which offers a plan around transitioning gas utilities from at utility scale, which is a very different thing from residential geothermal heating, for example. The future of heat offers a pathway to get the gas utilities off of the gas distribution circuit and into the renewable energy circuit. And somebody's going to, okay, Karen, give me a high sign when we're getting close to closing here. So I want to also thank you, Matt, for talking about the issue of methane. We often see carbon dioxide referenced as the greenhouse gas, but methane is huge and very much undercounted, and we need to get more information out about that. Okay, I'm going to go up here to the, there was a question about, and I've heard lots of questions about the use of the term net zero. We're talking about net zero by 2050, net zero emissions by 2050, not zero emissions by 2050. There's a lot of concern about what is meant exactly about that net zero piece. Can one of you comment on that? How real a concern is that?
Sure. No, I think it's a great question. I probably should have explained that better. And in fact, if you think back to that chart I showed you from the administration's work around the Clean Energy and Climate Plan and their own roadmap to 2050, you had all those sectors above the line, all the emissions and how they were going to dwindle or not. Below the line, there was a little green wedge that grew over time. There is a lot we can do. And in fact, the climate law includes natural solutions in it. That's something that our coalition fought for. Some of our allies were very much favor of. We can do better. We can manage our lands better. We can manage forests better. We can do agriculture differently in ways that that capture carbon much more efficiently in the trees and soil carbon. So there are important things that we can do, and there are things we have to do, because we're not going to get to zero emissions it's harder to envision getting to zero emissions because there are things like plane travel, for example, that it's harder to see electrifying plane travel. Maybe we go to some sort of a biofuel, but for that. But the other way you do it is you still have those emissions, but then you take up the carbon dioxide um, with some of these other techniques. So that's why we talk about net zero. It is important to say when you're talking about net zero, as the law does, and as the administration's own proceedings do, that X% shall come from actual reduction. So I think it's 85% in one
Yes.
case, 85 or 90%, but 85% shall come from actual reductions. So we're not going to count on trees absorbing more than they need to.
Right. Thank you. There was a question about transportation that I just would like to throw out there. The concern is that we do have a major plan in place around transportation emissions that's called the Transportation and Climate Initiative. It's a regional initiative, and it is basically on its way to being implemented. Certainly in Massachusetts, we have a governor who's very supportive of that. The concern is that there isn't enough done in the TCI, for Transportation and Climate Initiative, to deal with the need for public transportation. But in fact, there are bills here in Massachusetts. There's a TCI bill that really does look at both the environmental justice issue, but also the strong need to enhance and support transportation, public transit. It's a very critical piece, and I think it is recognized. So I don't know, Suzanne, if that answers your question adequately, but feel free to call me if you would like to discuss that more. Okay, Matt, you've got some comments on a real world situation with your son there. I think that was great.
I know you can't hear him, but he's been sitting next to me asking if I'm done yet for the past 15 minutes.
Are we there yet? Okay, because increase. Okay, don't. Okay, I think we answered some of these. Well, sorry, I was so interested in the questions and answers.
Lana, maybe Suzanne is asking an interesting question about converting to electric from
okay.
natural gas requires increased electric generation. This is to be covered by wind and solar. The answer essentially is yes, largely. If you look at the administration's own roadmaps for getting to 2050, by well, certainly by the end of that period, but offshore wind is projected to be, I can't remember the numbers, but something like 2/3 of the power mix. And remember, that's the power mix. That's not just supplanting the existing supply, but that's also taking into account the type of electrification that Matt has talked about and that we'll need in the transportation sector. And solar is the other big resource for that. Hydro, there certainly moves to try to make that a piece of it and help the pieces fit together. There's certainly controversy around that, but that's essentially what we're talking about. Even in the near term, if you move to electrified transportation, you're improving things by getting off of gasoline. Even with the electricity mix we have now, and certainly as the electricity mix continues to get cleaner, it's a big win from a climate perspective.
Thank you, John. Here's a question about a recent mass save assessment where this person was told that they should stay with their current gas system and install central air due to configuration of her house. So I think there was a provision, or is a provision in the law around mass save, no longer incentivizing, subsidizing efforts around sort of a reinstallation of a fossil fuel-based energy system, but rather switching those subsidies and incentives towards non-fossil fuel-based technologies. Matt or John, can you speak to that? Am I wrong about that, or did I dream that?
Yeah, that's not quite it. So the plan is to phase out incentives for fossil fuel equipment by 2025, which is the beginning of not the next 3-year plan, but the plan after that. I don't think that's in the law. I think it's just something that they're going to do. As of right now, the law says that they're going to account for the social cost of carbon when they do their cost effectiveness test, which is good. It like adds a benefit, so it might like make heat pumps seem better. It might raise incentives for heat pumps by some degree. but it wouldn't kind of result in a wholesale move. None of our research shows that it would result in a kind of wholesale move toward doing more emissions reduction via the program. It's just not how they make decisions. It's a resource reduction. It's called resource acquisition, right? They exist. All the laws, all the rules around what they do exist to reduce the use of energy, right? And electrification, like in some ways, it doesn't fit super comfortably in there. So we're working on it. And so there's also a question in the chat that just popped up, Linda. I've been talking about air source heat pumps because they're the most common in the marketplace. There are also ground source heat pumps. They cost like 50% more. The cost is a big problem in that area, but all the questions about cost, consumer cost, after you install the thing, they're just so super efficient that none of those things would be a problem.
Right. And I think, Matt, you and I had a brief email exchange on Dandelion ground source for residential that honestly, I'm very interested in looking into that for myself. And I believe it's less expensive than the traditional ground source heating systems that we've had in place until now. So I think again, these things are evolving and changing, and it's just a question of catching up.
I should say I have an air source heat pump in my own house.
Mm-hmm.
It works fine. What I always tell people is like, there's a lot of skepticism in the chat about this. Like, please trust me. I have it in my own house. I have 2 little kids under 5. I would never have put it in if it wasn't going to provide all my heat. It's just not a big deal. It's new, right? And strange, but at the end of the day, it's just not a big deal.
Well, everyone, we have reached the hour of 5:01, the hour and the minute of 5:01. As often is the case, you have the presentation and then you have the really interesting discussion after the presentation that could go on and on. I have saved the chat, and I will make sure I save the chat for any additional questions that we did not get to answer or address directly. I want to thank Karen and I both. Want to thank Matt Rusteika and John Rogers for this really amazing presentation. It's an awful lot of material to cover. Realize it was a high level and overview, but I think certainly every piece of this conversation is important to us here in Massachusetts. As members of the league and 2 members of the league on this Zoom meeting today, I'm going to encourage you to please, if you get an action alert about a bill, or if you get a message through League Leaders Group, Google group, that asks you to act, you're going to be getting one from me tomorrow. And it's about the future of heat, by the way. So please take a minute to read it and do the action. We try to make it as easy as possible for you. But public education, big, and countering the disinformation that's out there is absolutely enormously important. So I'm going to be quiet now. And again, thank you very much, Matt. Thank you very much, John Rogers. And thanks to all of our audience members for attending this webinar. It is recorded. It will be available to you via link. And at this point, I will be ending this session. Thank you.
Thanks
Have a
for
good
having us.
evening. Bye.
Thank you very much.